million game that the Conservatives are playing. And what's happening is that we're seeing now other opposition parties as opposed.
So we're just waiting for committee to start. It's going to be about 3 to 5 minutes.
In the game of the filibuster, bringing forward motions of concurrence. And I can appreciate the frustration that other opposition parties would be having, because day after day for weeks now, we have had the Conservative Party bringing forward a filibuster, putting the self-interest of the leader of the Conservative Party and the Conservative Party in general ahead of the interests of Canadians. So instead of us debating things such as the legislative agenda that will help and assist Canadians in many different ways, whether it's issues like protecting children against the internet, transferring military courts to civilian courts on issues of sexual violence, Mr. Speaker, to Canadian citizenship, to the fall economic statement. And that's just some of the government agenda, Mr. Speaker. Then you also have issues like private members' hours, opposition day motions. And I would have suggested to you that this would have been a great debate for an opposition day motion, Mr. Speaker. I truly believe so. Because at the end of the day, the issue of forced labor, as I say, is nothing new. Even though Stephen Harper and the current leader of the Conservative Party ignored it completely, 100% during their tenure, it would have been a great discussion to be able to have, at the end of it, have a positive resolution to it. You know, we have raised the issue in budgets, as it's been pointed out in terms of the motion itself that came before the Standing Committee. And I do compliment the efforts of the Standing Committee and those that they listened to in coming up with the report. But I would remind members that, you know, we have made a commitment to bring forward legislation that will look at improving S211, government legislation. Now, of course, one has to take a look in terms of why it is that we're having a difficult time getting legislation through the House of Commons. But that's no fault of the Government of Canada or even the Bloc or the New Democrats. That responsibility falls on the shoulders of the leader of the official opposition. So we will continue to look at ways in which we can bring in the legislation that we committed to do, Mr. Speaker. And hopefully that sense of enthusiasm that the first Conservative question was based on, Mr. Speaker, we'll see that when we bring in legislation, that there will be a warmth to the idea of allowing that debate to occur and possibly even allow legislation to go to committee and ultimately pass through third reading and be given royal assent, Mr. Speaker. What a wonderful idea that would be. But somehow we got to dislodge the leader of the Conservative Party's belief that this legislature or this Parliament is here to serve him and him alone. That we need to understand that this Parliament is here to serve Canadians and Canadians first and foremost. And then we'll be able to ultimately do more for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. So on the issue, one does not need to expand in terms of the literally millions of individuals around the world. Virtually in every country, Mr. Speaker, we will see forced labor being put into place. And we need to recognize, as we have as a government, that the government can play a significant role. Without the support, and I compliment, you know, there's some that have absolutely no time for the Senate. I, for one, see a great value in the Senate, and S211 is a good example of that. When the Senate of Canada passed that legislation through their system, Mr. Speaker, it came to the House of Commons. First reading of that bill took place on May the 3rd, 2022. Second reading then was completed on June 1st, 2022.
To 100 billion in the next 5 years. And leaders like Tabitha Bull from the CCIB have been clear that procurement is a key part of hitting that target. Since the 5% minimum target was implemented, the value of contracts going to Indigenous businesses increased by 1.5 billion. Now, while I've been the minister responsible for this file since 2021, our government has been engaging with Indigenous partners from across the country for years. In particular, I'd like to highlight the ways that the department has engaged with Indigenous partners to improve procurement procedures. We are transforming the procurement strategy with Indigenous partners. We are all focused on improving policies, safeguards, and processes. They have told us what will work and what does not, and we are listening. We're also actively working with partners on how best to transfer the role of defining and verifying Indigenous businesses to Indigenous peoples. Transferring the definition and the registration of Indigenous businesses from the government to Indigenous peoples will help us reach the ultimate goal of increased Indigenous economic activity. Parliamentarians need to work together, including through studies just like this one, to identify the existing barriers to economic reconciliation and new ways to break them down. Programs like PSIB are getting us closer to a Canada that maximizes its true economic potential. PSIB is opening doors for Indigenous participation, and historically those doors have been intentionally closed. Laws like the Indian Act systemically excluded Indigenous people to the point of being legislated out of the economy, as described by many Indigenous leaders. Members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to reinforce the federal government's commitment to building Canada's economy in partnership with Indigenous peoples, and I look forward to our conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll start with Mr. Genuis. Before we start, though, everyone, because we only have 1 hour with the minister, we're normally pretty loose watching the clock, but I'm going to stick to the exact 6, 5, 2.5 today, please. So please pay attention to your time clock. Mr. Genuis, go ahead, please.
Minister, should Randy Boissonnault still be in cabinet?
Well, I can tell you that the business that Mr. Boissonnault was involved in was never on the Indigenous business directory.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he should still be in cabinet?
That's not a decision for me to make, Mr. Genuis.
Okay. It's interesting that you're not saying yes. Do you endorse his conduct as minister?
I can tell you that Mr. Boissonnault's business was never listed on the Indigenous business directory.
He's a cabinet colleague of yours. You work together closely, I would presume. I ask if you think he should stay in cabinet, and you're declining to answer that. Do you endorse his conduct as minister? What do you think of what he has done?
I can tell you that GHI, the business that Mr. Boissonnault was co-owner of, was never been on the IBD.
Okay, I think you're saying a lot by not saying a lot, Minister. So I'll move on to my next question.
Yep.
Is Global Health Imports still eligible to receive government contracts?
I believe they are, but they are, as I said, not part of the Indigenous business directory. I can't answer in affirmative.
They represented themselves as Indigenous owned. They did so falsely. They are still eligible to receive government contracts. Do you think there should be penalties for companies that misrepresent their Indigenous identity? Should they be prevented from bidding further on government contracts?
In fact, there are penalties for fraudulent behavior, and I would hope that anybody that is procuring on behalf of the Government of Canada is careful about which businesses they procure from to make sure that proper business practices are followed. And certainly the Government of Canada has measures that it can take if it's found that businesses have acted fraudulently and should.
Okay. You mentioned there are consequences for fraudulent activity, which I hope would include misrepresentations around Indigenous identity. Did Global Health Imports, in your view, as the Indigenous Services Minister, engage in fraudulent activity?
I can't make that determination, but I can tell you that the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance with PSPC can take steps such as banning a business from future...
Sorry, I'll just jump in because I know there are options available, but okay, you don't want to rule specifically on the case of Global Health Imports. Let's take a hypothetical case where you have a company involved in health imports, let's say, that's owned by two people. Hypothetically, one of them happens to be a minister of the Crown, and they are bidding on government contracts and in the process claim to be an Indigenous-owned company. That claim turns out to be completely false. If that hypothetical company, in the process of pursuing government contracts, falsely claimed to be Indigenous-owned, would that be considered fraudulent activity?
It could possibly be, but that would be a decision by the Office of the Supplier Integrity and Compliance. I don't run that particular organization, so I would say that from my perspective, when there's allegations of fraud, it's very serious. And I think departments have a responsibility to ensure that they're procuring from companies that are not fraudulent. So
right, but so just definitionally, right? Like it would seem that the definition of fraud is misrepresenting the facts in some way in order to achieve a commercial advantage. Right? Pretending something is true when it's not in order to achieve a commercial advantage. So you have a company that pretended to be Indigenous owned when it wasn't Indigenous owned. The purpose of that pretense was clearly to increase its chances of getting government contracts that it wouldn't have otherwise gotten. Is that fraud?
What I would say is I think we're saying the same thing, that the process of ensuring that people claiming indigeneity should be with integrity, because what we want is we want Indigenous economic success. So I think we agree. And I think that any time that there's fraud in terms of allegations of identity, that is a very serious infraction. Now, what happens next is up to places like the Office of Supplier Integrity, but I can tell you that we, on our side, in Indigenous Services Canada, take integrity around indigeneity seriously. Although it is challenging.
And let me jump in here. I would hope the Prime Minister would take that integrity seriously and fire this minister from cabinet. Just in the time that I have left, Minister, are there any other companies owned by Liberal cabinet ministers or MPs, former MPs or Liberal appointed senators that are on the Indigenous business list?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but we can commit to checking that out for you and getting the information back. Okay,
thank you. I think the committee would agree that we're interested in receiving that in the usual timeline, a list, the names of any companies on the Indigenous business list that are owned by Liberal MPs, cabinet ministers, appointed senators, or former MPs.
Thank you very much. Mr. Batiste for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Patty, for joining us, Minister. You know, there's a lot of, we heard from Joanna Bernard, the Regional Chief of New Brunswick, there's a lot of complexities involved in Indigenous identity. She had mentioned, you know, the challenges around the second generation cutoff, where if you have children outside of people registered under the Indian Act for 2 successive generations, that you lose your status as an Indian. And so there's a definite cutoff point for First Nations or status Indians in Canada. However, when we're talking about Inuit, when we're talking about Métis, there isn't that definition in place that we can look to. In fact, the Supreme Court of Canada said in the Daniels case that there was no consensus definition for what it is to be Métis, nor need there be. During the study of C-53, we heard, you know, there was a lot of people who believe that if you have Indigenous and European ancestry, that you're a Métis. But we know that, that's not the recognized definition from the Métis National Council. And so I'm wondering if when we're looking at this, when we're looking at Indigenous identity and the overall job of government to try to figure out who should be eligible and who shouldn't be eligible, do we have help from any organizations that can help guide government? Because, it's pretty clear in UNDRIP, which is law, under Article 33, that nations want the ability to determine who their own citizens are, and that's part of the work why we're working with AFN on the second generation cutoff. I'm wondering if you can speak to first, what kind of outside help are we getting from Indigenous organizations to help clarify these very muddy waters when it comes to people thinking they might be Indigenous because they have some mixed ancestry in somewhere in their family lineage, and how do we educate Canadians as to what are the actual defined definitions of the different First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada?
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Before you proceed, and I've stopped the clock, I understand there's some people in the room taking photos. Please, that's not allowed, so just FYI, please. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, MP Batiste. And I think you've touched on something that I think is essentially very sensitive and kind of a legacy of a colonial system that was designed to divide people into categories of Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And the challenge is that, of course, those definitions evolve. You mentioned second generation cutoff, and you would know as one of the MPs heavily invested in the study that's going on right now that even that issue of second generation cutoff is a sensitive issue for families impacted, but also for communities that are impacted. There is a criteria for inclusion on the Indigenous Business Directory. I can read it out here, but I'm sure you already understand that as part of your study right now. We are working with First Nations partners, business partners in particular, like NACA, like the CCIB, like ITK, like the Métis Nation, and various different Métis nations that are not part of Métis Nation of Canada. These are the commitments that we've made as a government, is to continue to have these complicated conversations with Indigenous people as they define for themselves how to define their memberships. And I think it is an important conversation for Indigenous people to have, but for Canadians to understand that it isn't as clear cut as some would like to think, or some would like to have it be, quite clearly.
And so we heard from Regional Chief Joanna Bernard that this was one of the things that was a concern for her. I offered to AFN to submit something to this committee that kind of clarified where they stood on the Indigenous identity. I'm wondering if your department has received any kind of resolution from AFN stating, this is where we would like to see this conversation go next, because you're right. The First Nations I've talked to across Canada do not want a government committee, do not want a government department stating who and who isn't a member of their community. I think you've said that. I agree with it. And I think so. How do we best manage that situation when you have communities saying, well, we don't want the colonial mistakes of the past to continue. Rather, we want to be a part of the solution. How are we doing that?
First of all, do you want to just speak to the AFN resolution, Keith?
No.
Okay. Okay. All right. I will just say, first of all, that what we are doing is working with a variety of different Indigenous organizations, including the AFN, to look at ways that the government can transfer the responsibility for Indigenous procurement, Indigenous business directory to Indigenous organizations. And so far, as you would know, there isn't a consensus yet. I've been thinking a lot about consensus in this space, and I think, there isn't a consensus in Parliament, as you know, on legislation, on approaches. So I think sometimes the federal government looks for consensus in Indigenous places or Indigenous spaces in an unrealistic or maybe an unfair way. And so we are working with partners right now about how best to transfer the responsibility for indigeneity and proof of indigeneity without driving towards a one list solution. That may be part of the evolution of how this goes, simply because I think as I've gotten to know the partners, it appears that consensus may not be feasible in this space, and that is a reality with such a diverse group of Indigenous people across the country.
Yes, and we've definitely seen
I'm
it.
afraid that's
Okay.
our time.
I'll get another round.
Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Over the past few months, I'll give you time to get your earpieces on. Thank you. It wasn't just you, but for everybody. Yes, I'm trying to improve my understanding, my comprehension. Yeah, no problem. It's for everybody around the table. My questions are good for everybody. Now, over the past few months, we noticed, or it was found, that some businesses were found to not be Indigenous, even though they qualified themselves as such. I was wondering, during the audits or the checks, were there businesses that ended up not being actual Indigenous businesses?
Every 2 years, the department audits the indigeneity of businesses, just because businesses transform quite a bit in between audits. And today, in 2022, 1,100 Indigenous businesses were removed from the Indigenous Business Directory as part of a cleanup of businesses that were registered before 2019. I could maybe turn to Keith to speak about those.
Et de ces 1122 entreprises,
Of these 1,122 businesses, which documents were requested to show and to prove their Indigenous businesses, or to show that they weren't considered as such any longer?
Let me just get the list here. Do you have the list? The evidence required for registration on the list of being an Indigenous person includes, but isn't limited to, Indian registration in Canada, citizenship with the Manitoba Métis Federation, Northwest Territories Métis Nation Saskatchewan, or a governing member of the Métis National Council, including the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Métis Nation of BC, and the Métis Nation of Ontario, or a membership in an affiliate of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples or other recognized Indigenous organization in Canada, or acceptance as an Indigenous person by an established Indigenous community in Canada, or enrollment or entitlement to be enrolled pursuant to a comprehensive land claim agreement, or membership or entitlement to membership in a group with an accepted comprehensive claim. So the list there is a criteria. There are documentations required for each of those claims.
vous pourrez envoyer ces critères, celles de
Oui.
Merci au comité.
Could you please send those to committee? Thank you. You mentioned it earlier, but right now, there are a lot of questions being asked about who controls the IBD, who validates the indigenous nature of a business, and so on. In my opinion, it's really not up to us to tell a First Nation whether it is one or not. That's really up to them to determine who's a member, who's a business from their community. You were saying that you're looking for consensus. I want to ask a little bit more about the transfer of responsibility for the directory. Of course, we want a consensus, but what would it be in the end? What conditions would you have for that consensus?
Mais je pense
Inaudible. I believe there are other choices that the government can make with partners. For example, they can set up a separate list for each entity, for example.
Still in discussion with the Indigenous partners about the best way to do this. For example, maybe each partner could have their own list. And I think what we would all agree at this committee is we don't want to do anything that weakens the opportunity for businesses. And so it's a delicate piece of work to find a path to transfer the list in a way that doesn't make it harder for government departments to procure from Indigenous businesses. What I really don't want to see is the government saying, this is too hard, we won't do it at all. And so I think everybody agrees at this table, this is a big, important piece of Canada's GDP growth.
Lors de sa comparution, vous parlez de discussion.
You talked about discussions and so on. I'm wondering who takes part in those discussions, who's listening, or who has to listen. Mr. Shane, who was from the Funding Association for these businesses, stated that there were attempts to work with the government, but that there were a lot of delays. They had a difficult time getting the support of Indigenous Services Canada for various projects, for infrastructure, for their organization, and so on. A letter was apparently sent to you, and the National Chief also sent a letter. There still has been no answer, is what we were told. So I have a few questions left, but those are my questions. Who are the ones discussing, and who are the ones having to listen?
You could provide a brief answer.
Really quickly, yes, there's over 30 partners, so I won't read them out, Mr. Chair, as that will take quite a long time, but we will distribute the list of the partners that have been involved in the consultations on how we move forward with the list.
Thank you. Ms. Blaney for 6, please.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Minister and her team for being here with us today to discuss this really important issue. And I think my first question, I really appreciate what you said about making sure that there's a process that you can pass some of this on to an Indigenous organization to do the work. I'm just wondering, though, is there any discussions internally about recognizing that Indigenous people should be the people who decide who their membership is? And what does that process look like? I expect it to be a bumpy road, but I think that one of the things I have concerns about is that the decision isn't being made. It's just sort of a discussion that keeps happening. So what work is actually happening to get that to the communities who had it in the first place and need it to be returned?
The lists were in the communities to begin? Is that what you mean?
The nations to decide who their membership is.
Yeah. I mean, this is ultimately the goal of decolonization, is to for the federal government to be out of the space of defining who is Indigenous.
So what's blocking that process from happening, though?
Concerns from a variety of different partners about people claiming indigeneity or claiming connection to community without necessarily being Indigenous or Indigenous descent. In fact, that's a part of this study, and I think this study is incredibly valuable.
Sorry to interrupt, but what I'm talking about is Indigenous communities deciding who is Indigenous and taking the government out of it completely. I understand what the intention is, but I'm wondering what is the process to that actually happening? Because it's something that keeps coming up, government after government, and it's not getting done. So I'm wondering what is the part
I would dispute
that
it's not getting done. I mean, we've done quite a bit, as you know, on sex-based discrimination and restoring people's...
excuse me, but you're still keeping it within the government. This is a colonial system. The longer that we keep the identity of Indigenous people decided by a colonial system, that's the problem. It needs to go back to Indigenous communities, and they should be the ones deciding how that's going to work and what kind of processes that they would have around identifying that. I understand some of the complexity, but I think Indigenous communities understand it. So I think Mr. Khan is going to respond.
Yes, thanks for the question. So as it currently exists, we have, like, for example, the Inuit. The Inuit determine their membership, not Canada, in terms of land claim beneficiaries. The Métis nations, all the governing boards have criteria for membership. They determine the membership, not Canada. The same applies to First Nations. Generally, the First Nations either use the Indian Act system in terms of registration, or they manage their own membership codes for membership. So they determine their membership.
It's still going through the government of Canada. You know the process as well as I do.
The liberty to remove themselves from the Union Act is there to manage their own membership codes at their discretion. And following up on a previous question, so at this time, we are currently engaging as a department First Nations leadership, communities, elders, to find solutions for the second generation cutoff as we speak. So those discussions are ongoing. So
Okay,
those are
thank you for that. So, you know, I hear what you're saying, and I just will respectfully say that the system is still held by the government. This is how it works. And we know that Indigenous people who are trying to fight these issues often have no choice but to go to the federal government to try to get support. And often the federal government says, I don't want to touch this because they don't want to be part of the identity process, but they are also still holding the reins. So my concern is that until that is done, it makes all of these other systems continue to falter. And what that does is it pits Indigenous people against Indigenous people, which is not very helpful. But it also means that the fraudulent claims are blocking Indigenous businesses that are legit from finding those opportunities because other people are using people or putting forward things that are not true. So I do want to say that I think it is incredibly important that be stepped out of, because until it's gone, until Indigenous communities and Indigenous processes are in place, we're going to continue to see these things. So I'm just wondering, Minister, you talked about the fact that it is fraudulent to pretend that you're of Indigenous identity, and you talked about penalties. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, and if there's something that's actually done to make people accountable? We're seeing more and more people pretending that they are of Indigenous identity, which I think is very interesting and very concerning, and actually in a lot of ways pretty easy in terms of Indigenous communities to identify. So I'm just wondering, what are the penalties, and how do you work with the Indigenous communities that have had people claim they belong to them that don't? How do you support them as well?
Well, thanks. And I think, so that's the flip side is that Indigenous communities often feel threatened by new people coming to community who sometimes claim connection to community, sometimes through issues of second generation cutoff, quite frankly. And that's why the study is so important, because in fact, some chiefs have said that people appear to claim membership, and in fact, they don't, as leaders of the community, recognize their lineage or their connection.
Sorry, that's me downloading.
And I
something in
think
the background.
you're also right that all of this.
I apologize, Minister. That is our time. We're going to go to Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to all of you joining us here today. Minister, we have heard repeatedly from Indigenous groups that the majority of the money that the government claims is going to Indigenous companies is actually going to shell companies and not Indigenous companies. And we've just read recently in the news a great example of this with the company owned by Randy Boissonnault. And even though GHI was not listed on the Indigenous Business Directory, and you made mention of that, I think your departmental officials know differently and have agreed that they are still eligible to receive funding from ISC. We've also heard that there are little to no consequences for companies who pretend to be Indigenous. And I want to quote Shannon Mehta-Tawabin, CEO of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. And they would have stated that there are very little penalties and that there need to be penalties for sure. And he actually went on to say it's criminal behavior to conduct fraud. So we have to take other steps and demonstrate to the world and to Canada that those actors who are engaging in this activity don't use this window and this program to access the federal government in a bad way. Do you agree that it's criminal behavior and that there should be penalties?
First of all, what I would say is I think we're saying the same thing in that Indigenous business procurement is a really critical aspect of Canada's economic growth, and we have to take it seriously.
I asked a very direct question.
And I'm going to give you a very direct answer.
Then I would ask you to get to that answer, please.
Great. And as I was saying, and that's why it's so important that we ensure that there isn't fraud in the space of claiming indigeneity. Now, as you know, Indigenous Services Canada...
Minister, my question was, do you believe it's criminal behavior when a non-Indigenous company claims to be Indigenous to steal money from Indigenous-owned companies through the set-aside?
What I would say is that fraud is fraud, and we do have an office that can look into claims of fraudulent behavior and apply a variety of penalties. And so I can't specifically give a general sweeping statement because, of course, different companies have different circumstances. But I would expect that anyone who's contracting through the federal government ensure that the laws of the land are upheld, including ensuring that fraud is not rewarded.
Thank you. Thank you. So Randy Boissonnault is a cabinet minister in the government of Canada. He's your colleague. He falsely claimed to be Indigenous in order to steal money set aside for Indigenous-owned businesses. As the Minister of Indigenous Services, will you commit to holding your colleague to account for running a company that falsely claimed to be Indigenous?
Well, as you know, first of all, I just want to reiterate that any false claims of indigeneity hurts the goal that I think you are obviously in favor of, which is increasing Indigenous economic activity in this country. And so
as
I would say that
as the Minister of Indigenous Services, what will you do to hold your cabinet colleague to account for trying to defraud the government of Canada by claiming to be an Indigenous-owned business when they weren't?
I think I've been clear that Mr. Boissonnault's company has never been on the list.
That's not the question I'm asking. His actions speak for themselves. He claimed to be Indigenous. He claimed to be running an Indigenous business in order to access the set-aside that was meant for Indigenous-owned businesses. Will you join other members of Parliament in calling for his resignation? This file falls directly under your authority. And if you can go back to the Indigenous communities in your riding and tell them that he should not be held to account, that what he does was just fine, I think they will have something to say about that. You are the Minister of Indigenous Services. You have ministerial accountability. And when you know for fact that one of your colleagues has defrauded or attempted to defraud the government of Canada by claiming to be an Indigenous-owned business for the sole purpose of accessing something that they shouldn't have access to, I think you have a duty to call that member to account, especially when it falls under your jurisdiction as a minister.
Well, I'm really excited that we're talking about my riding, but
obviously my time is up, so I won't get to share with you about my incredible riding. But we are going to Ms. Atwin. I'm sure you might be able to give a response during her time. There, I just took away your time for you. Go ahead, Ms. Atwin, for 5.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and always good to see you in Committee Minister as well as our important officials. Would you like to speak about your wonderful riding and answer that question?
Just for a few moments, in the current iteration of my riding, there are 12 First Nations in my riding, and in the new riding setup, I'll have another 7 First Nations in Northern Ontario. And so I rely on my riding quite a bit, actually, to, in particular, many chiefs in my riding, Chief Mushquash, Chief Mashano, many chiefs have given me great advice about how to hold this very colonial portfolio with the utmost respect for First Nations. And so I'm very grateful to their advice.
Excellent, thank you. You mentioned the criteria for being listed on the Indigenous Business Directory. Can you speak to some of the checks and balances that exist to ensure that process has integrity?
Absolutely, and I have a whole what the department does in order to ensure that people are on the list. I think I mentioned earlier that every 2 years an audit is conducted of the entire list to make sure that people's credentials have not changed in some way. The corporation structure has not changed in some way, as you know, increasingly. And this is a good sign. Corporations are growing, actually, and changing and acquiring other corporations. And so all of that must be sort of verified on the list. Of course, if a business is found to be non-compliant, they are removed and they can't compete for any contracts through the Indigenous Business Directory list. And of course, there are a number of pre-award audits that, in fact, since December 2023, led to the removal of 2 businesses from the list. And there are a number of post-award audits currently underway. And these are conducted by third-party auditors to make sure that we are really protecting the integrity of the goal of the program, which is to increase Canada's GDP and business economic development for Indigenous peoples.
Thank you. And you mentioned in 2019 that there had been a cleanup of the list. Did eligibility change, or it was just a process for the department to look back and make sure that there was integrity?
So it was really a process of looking back and making sure that integrity was still there, that the list itself was as refreshed as we could possibly make it. As I said, oftentimes people start off in one business formation and may acquire partners or other corporations. And so this is why the every 2 year audit is very important. So that we can actually understand how companies are changing over time. And, you know, I would say that most companies are good actors and they will tell us when things are changing and they will keep up to date their information. But obviously, and, you know, I think all colleagues around this table are very diligently working on ensuring the economic success of Indigenous business. And we have to do that by preserving and holding close the integrity of the process.
And we know that this is largely targets, you know, individual businesses or entrepreneurs. It could be tribal councils as well. But it also impacts the communities. Can you speak to how, you know, what are the knock-on effects of investing in Indigenous businesses, and what are those larger economic impacts for communities?
I think that's such an important piece of this story, which is the growth of not only Indigenous business, but the growth of Canada's GDP through economic activity. And, you know, we've often talked about the cost of keeping people out. And in fact, there's a lot of study around the continued exclusion. In fact, it's estimated to cost Canada's economy $27.7 billion each year by keeping people out of the economy. So that, to me, is just a dollars and cents reason, never mind any other reason for supporting Indigenous economic success. And in fact, I know you're from the East Coast, and there are a lot of very successful businesses on the East Coast run by Indigenous peoples. And I would imagine you see that impact in your own community. I'm from Northern Ontario. In fact, the CDC in Northern Ontario is partnered with a number of different First Nations organizations to conduct a study of the economic impact benefit of Indigenous business in Northern Ontario. And there are older studies that estimate, you know, huge amounts of revenue for non-Indigenous communities that have a high degree of Indigenous economic activity. So exclusion is really expensive. And, you know, this is the fiscally smart thing to do, is to make sure that people have this opportunity. And the last thing I'll say is it's exciting when I visit First Nations that also have corporations that are benefiting their communities. So many First Nations are now, for example, holding their own contracting and construction companies.
That is our time, Minister. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hajdu, until very recently, an Indigenous woman who had children with a non-Indigenous man saw her children be considered non-Indigenous. That went on for 50 to 60 years. I think it's Section C2 or something. I could be wrong, but finally that was removed. Now, when it was the case of an Indigenous man having children with a non-Indigenous woman, those kids were Indigenous. Now, coming back to those children born of Indigenous women who didn't used to be recognized but now are, when they want to set up a business and be have it be considered an Indigenous business, that can complicate things. Now, in terms of the list, maybe the solution would be to have more than just one list. Why not have one list, but that is fed by the lists from other organizations, those with whom you cooperate, as you call them?
Sorry.
And of course, it would be a given that those lists would be kept up to date, and that would put an end to the situations such as the ones I described, where the children were or were not recognized or so on. And that's really, that happened because of the all-powerful Canadian government. So that's my first question. Mr. Ducharme of the Business Directory was saying that he was a witness here and said that his list was not recognized as being a valid one, even though they were Indigenous businesses on that list. How can we ensure that there is complete understanding and consensus when we are not recognizing what the Indigenous organizations themselves are doing?
30 seconds for a response.
Well, first of all, I think the study that this committee is doing is going to be very helpful in identifying alternative pathways to making sure that we keep the integrity of the Indigenous business procurement strategy intact. I mean, I think we're all saying the same thing, that we want Indigenous businesses to succeed. We want Indigenous people to have control over identifying who is Indigenous, and we want the government ultimately to get out of the business of identifying indigeneity. And the challenge will be to make sure that we do so in a way that doesn't make it more difficult for people to procure from Indigenous businesses, but really keeps that same system of being able to quickly identify Indigenous businesses to reach the target. I have to say that, we've done incredible work as a government over the last 10 years to meet the...
Minister,
I exceeded my time.
We only have
Thank you,
2.5
Mr. Chair.
minutes, I'm afraid.
No worries. Thank you.
Ms. Blaney, please.
Well, thank you, Chair. So if I could just come back to the idea you were talking about, Minister, about meeting with stakeholders and looking at the plan moving forward of what that's going to look like. Do you have any timelines that you could share with the committee on that work? Is there actual timelines? Because, I heard a lot of back and forth about the integrity of the process, but we also know that even with the process, people were fraudulently accessing these funds. So I understand to the level of integrity that you can have in the process, it's there, but it's obviously not there to the level that we would all like to see, I hope. So I'm just wondering if you could share a timeline moving forward of how this process is going to actually unfold and how long are we going to have to wait?
I'd like to turn to Jessica to talk about the consultations that have been underway and maybe a little bit about the timeline as well.
Thank you for the question. Since 2021, there's been work undertaken by something called the Transformative Indigenous Procurement Strategy, which is set to wrap up in 25-26. There's been extensive consultations both with Indigenous economic development organizations as well as directly with Indigenous businesses and communities. We're taking the feedback directly from those engagements to formulate next steps and move forward in the timeline. So we're looking specifically at the transfer of the validation and verification function of businesses, changes to the existing procurement strategy for Indigenous business that are designed to address the opportunities that exist for continuous improvement.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So I'm just wondering, at what point does the government get out of the business completely so that it's run by Indigenous led? I mean, this is what you're talking about. And I just want to say that, it is not owned by First Nations people, for sure, identity. I mean, I have status children. Their children will have a lesser status because I'm not Indigenous. That's how it works. So that means that you can eventually get to a generation where you don't have status. So to me, this is the problem. The problem is that the government's involved. So you're talking about getting out? When?
I think Jessica was clear that the goal is that we would be able to have something in place by 2025, and I would say that sooner if possible. And I'm in conversations with the partners themselves, who all agree that as soon as possible they would like to manage lists, but they also all agree that they don't want a dilution of procurement from Indigenous businesses, and so that's the balance we're trying to reach.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barrett for 5, please.
Minister, today Canada's first Indigenous Justice Minister and Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who, as you know, was fired from cabinet by Mr. Trudeau for speaking out against and trying to stop his attempted obstruction of justice. She issued a statement online, and it said, "A prime minister committed to true reconciliation would have removed Randy and the other Randy from cabinet long ago. Instead, we get to watch white people play ancestry Wheel of Fortune. So shameful and extremely destructive." Do you agree with that characterization?
What I would say is that Indigenous identity is any use of Indigenous identity in a fraudulent way undermines Indigenous people.
Okay, so we have a member of your cabinet, a member of your caucus, who a 50% owner of a company that claimed to be wholly Indigenous owned, applied for government contracts under that false pretense. To dispense with the pleasantries, Randy Boissonnault lied about who he is in order to profit, and in doing so, attempted to disenfranchise legitimate and actual Indigenous-owned businesses. Do you think that that is appropriate? And if you don't think it's appropriate, do you think that he should remain in cabinet?
What I would say is that GHI, the company in question, was never on the Indigenous Business Directory.
Right, and so they applied.
I cannot, for example, weigh in on what decision points were made when GHI was awarded contracts. And so I can tell you, though, with very high degree of confidence that he was not on the list.
He wasn't on
indigeneity.
So he wasn't on the list. We know that he has previously said that he was Indigenous. He is now saying that he is not. So we know that he applied for a contract saying he was Indigenous. And this is the point that Ms. Wilson-Raybould has made. And it certainly undermines reconciliation. Would you agree that a cabinet minister claiming indigeneity to win government contracts and remaining in cabinet undermines the government's stated goal of reconciliation?
Well, I think Mr. Boissonnault's statement is on record, but what I can say is what I've just said, which is I think that when people utilize false claims of indigeneity, it's extremely harmful to Indigenous people, and it's extremely harmful to the process of reconciliation.
So thank you for that. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, said this morning, "I'm happy that he, Randy Boissonnault, is continuing to lead on issues around jobs and employment and represent Alberta in our government." So you agree that it's harmful. The Prime Minister doesn't. So do you agree or do you disagree with the Prime Minister with his delight that Mr. Boissonnault, who is a fraudster, is continuing to represent Alberta in the government of Canada, in your cabinet, all the while attempting to disenfranchise Indigenous individuals and Indigenous-owned businesses?
Well, I think what is important here is that it's not up to me or any other person to police people's indigeneity. And so for me, this isn't about...
Minister, he said it's not for you to police. He said he lied. So he's the one who said he lied. You know that he lied. And you just need to have the moral clarity to say that what he did was wrong. It undermines reconciliation. And that type of fraud is unacceptable in your government. The rest of my time to Mr. Genuis.
Are there any instances of companies facing consequences for Indigenous identity fraud that you can identify?
I don't think I can answer that question.
Okay, I'll go to something else, but if you could provide us with a list afterwards of any instances of companies that have been faced consequences for Indigenous identity fraud and what those consequences would be. It's been reported that Randy Boissonnault's claims that his great-grandmother was Cree, that those claims were false. Those were claims that he personally made in the House of Commons. They have now been revealed to be false. Do you have any comment on that?
My comment stands. The issue of indigeneity, is not for me to determine who is Indigenous, but that in general, claims of indigeneity
Chair, and
that are
just
false
in
are
the
very
seconds I
harmful
have
to Indigenous
left,
peoples.
the minister in the last round referenced the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance as being able to answer certain questions that she has not able to answer. I wonder if there'd be agreement for us to hear from the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance at some point to help shed some further light on these things.
That is your time.
Thank
Thanks. And we'll finish up with Mr. Batiste. Go ahead, please, for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm finding the whole conservative narrative a little bit problematic. I think that there are several different groups, whether it be academia, whether it be music, that have struggled with this question of who is Indigenous and who isn't. They're asking you to be the overall overseer and policing of this, and I can tell you that First Nations don't want that as a non-Indigenous minister to tell you who and who isn't Indigenous. But I feel it's even more hypocritical because when I was the Mi'kmaq coordinator for the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, their citizenship code, I was watching as the Harper Conservatives stumbled through this whole process themselves with
Harper.
the recognition of the Mi'kmaq of Hajdu, where they, as part of their government, used a Métis test for First Nations in Newfoundland that resulted in 100,004 applications for a First Nations band. Now, the Conservatives would have you believe that everyone who thought they had a family member who was Mi'kmaq committed fraud. 104,000 people all across the Atlantic believed, they were eligible for this process because of the Harper-led Conservatives in this space of trying to identify who is Indigenous. So for them to sit up over here and say that we should have all the answers when they stumbled through their whole process on this, where I have people coming to my riding office.
Is there a question in here, or are you just ranting?
I was approved originally as a status Mi'kmaq, but now they revoked my status because I didn't have the things, and asking me why this is, because it's a complicated process. And I'm just wondering, Minister, if you think it's a little bit hypocritical, this whole narrative from the Conservatives trying to make something that's very complicated as simple as just the minister should, check a box and say, this is what it is to be Indigenous.
I think that's a really great point from an Indigenous person, which is that it should never be the minister pronouncing from this seat or really any seat with such little fact or information who is Indigenous. In fact, indigeneity, as you point out, is complex. There's an individual from a riding nearby me that has been raised in an adoptive family in a First Nation. He is non-Indigenous by birth, but he was adopted as an infant and has been fully adopted by the community. If you met him, you would not think he was Indigenous. He studies Indigenous issues. He speaks the language. He has been raised as an Indigenous person since he was 2 or 3 months old. And even his own narrative is one of complexity. How does he find himself in this place? And how does he navigate as someone who's deeply steeped in his family and his culture and his tradition, and yet fully non-Indigenous by birth, by DNA? And so I'm really glad that you raised this point. And all of this is the legacy of a colonial government that chose to, in those early days, divide people and dispossess people of land, culture, and language and identity. And now we're all here grappling with how to get back to a place where Indigenous people for themselves define who are members of their community, but also that we make amends as a country by ensuring that there is more equity in the systems that serve us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And in the time remaining, these are problems that we have to resolve collaboratively with First Nations communities. They have their own First Nations procurement organization that they're trying to set up because they have identified their problems around this. And I know the question that has been answered is what are we doing to make space for them to take control? I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where we are in the second generation cutoff consultation that we started with AFN in December to address these very concerns that were being brought to this table right now in a collaborative approach with First Nations youth, with First Nations communities, and just if you could talk about what that process is looking like.
Well, yes, and thank you again for your help in designing how to get this off the ground in a respectful way. Even the consultation has been designed by Indigenous peoples because it is such an emotional and heated space. I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about is we're talking about families where, for example, Chief Bernard told me a very moving story where one of her children, her grandchildren are Indigenous or ordained Indigenous, and on the other child's lineage, those grandchildren are not, simply because of the nature of who her children chose to marry, and how painful that is for that family. And so those consultations are underway, and I believe they're happening in a very compassionate way because we chose to design those consultations together with First Nations peoples so that we could get to the answers about how to support people to reunite their families.
You can say thank you. That's about it.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you for the
And colleagues, that is our time. We are going to suspend to excuse the minister and bring our next set of witnesses in. We are.
Okay, so that's the first hour. The second hour is going to be even better. We're going to be talking about Tom Clark, and we're calling in, I believe it's the Department of Foreign Affairs. So as we wait for them to just bring in the next guests and answer on Tom Clark's $9 million condo on Billionaires Row in New York, let's tune into the House. Or we can check to see what's going on in Proc for a sec. Proc might be...
Speaking order,
it
would go to Mr. Cooper and then to Mr. Turnbull. If I am not overturned, then the speaking order will remain as I had it originally in my judgment, which would be Mr. Cooper, Mr. Duncan, Mr. Bertud, Mr. Calkins, Mr. Turnbull. So we are going to vote, and
Just
the
before
direction
that.
of where this goes will be based on that.
Point of
Mr.
order.
Bertud, I'm going to very quickly entertain this, but colleagues, but just 1 second. Colleagues, it's very unusual for the chair to not go right to a vote once it's been called. So this is not something that I'm going to entertain, generally speaking, moving forward. So I'll turn the floor briefly to you, Mr. Bertud, and you will be the last speaker, and then we're going to the vote.
Monsieur le Président, on peut pas challenger.
Mr. Chair, we cannot challenge a proposal that hasn't been, you haven't taken a decision. You took no decision. You indicated that there was a list, but you didn't give your decision on that until you give the floor to Berthold. You can't challenge it because otherwise every note that you take is going to be challenged. It's not how we should be working. The decision is taken when you gave the floor to Mr. Duncan. And then Mr. Turnbull, you'd say, hey, I was the next guy on the list. And you said, well, I have on my list so, but you didn't take a decision on that. That's not a decision. I have my list. We're going to start challenging every note that you take. You didn't decide to give the floor to Mr. Duncan or Turnbull yet. You haven't done that.
I don't like Ben Carr as a chair. I think he's horribly biased, and he really doesn't know what he's doing. And just for those who are tuning in or have just tuned in recently, we're just waiting for the other committee to get its witnesses in. So we're just watching another committee, which Cooper's in, while we wait for the one that Barrett and Brock are in to get back. I was watching this a bit
okay, so
on the other monitor.
Mr. Bertha, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take.
They've been having
I'm going to
troubles
take
all
what you're
committee.
suggesting at face value, but here I imagine is what's going to happen. Either way, Mr. Cooper is about to get the floor again. I presume Mr. Turnbull is then going to raise his hand, and now that I have indicated what the speaking list is, he's going to challenge it. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. Mr. Cooper is going to get the floor, okay, and then we'll see where things go from there, and we will or we will not come back to this particular point. However, seeing that the time is now after 12, although I am sure that this is exhilarating for our witnesses who are here and have done a fantastic job of not contributing to the discussion. I'm going to ask our witnesses, I'm going to thank our witnesses. I'm going to relieve them of their duties here because we do have a second panel if and when we get to that. But I want to thank Messieurs Dicard, Bedard, Jantz, McDonnell, Leblanc, et Aubé. Gentlemen, I'm sorry that we were not able to get into a more substantive discussion with you around the table, but if anybody understands that things can happen in the context of a parliamentary sitting, it would be you folks. So thank you very much for your time. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
We haven't, okay.
The floor.
I'm just going to check the other committee.
Well, thank you very much,
Still in recess.
Mr. Chair. And here we have a situation where members of Parliament, 19 of them were, and senators, 19 parliamentarians, not including members of Parliament and senators, were the target of a cyber attack by the Beijing-directed, Beijing-controlled ATP 31. Those members of Parliament were kept in the dark for 3 years by this government. This government knew about the ATP 31 attack when it happened in January of 2021. And notwithstanding that, there were no efforts made to inform members of Parliament that they were the target of the Beijing regime, no efforts to inform them so that they could take appropriate steps to protect themselves. Indeed, these members of Parliament and senators would have had no idea that they were the target of the Beijing regime but for an indictment out of the Department of Justice in the U.S. And it was only then that they became aware of the fact that they were the target. And that led to the finding of the Speaker of a prima facie question of privilege, which has now been referred to this committee. And I would note that while members of Parliament were kept in the dark, CSIS and the CSE and the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office, the Prime Minister's own department, and multiple departments within this government had received briefings about the ATP 31 attack. And so, very simply put, there was a complete breakdown in notifying MPs. But this is part of a pattern because this has happened before. We know that this government was aware that sitting members of Parliament, including MP Michael Chong, were the target of the Beijing regime, and yet he was kept in the dark, resulting in a finding of the Speaker of a prima facie question of privilege, which came before this committee and which we studied. And so what we have is a government that has been less than transparent, that has failed to provide transparency and sunlight, and frankly has at times outright covered up and turned a blind eye to Beijing's interference. We have, in this case, or not in this case, but following what happened in the case of MP Chong, the Minister of Public Safety in May of 2023 issued a directive requiring CSIS to brief MPs if they are the target of foreign interference. It is interesting that following the issuance of that order, there was a briefing of multiple government departments, including the Prime Minister's Department, the PCO, about this ATP 31 attack, and notwithstanding the order of the House, those departments were briefed, but the sitting members of Parliament continued to be left in the dark. It raises questions about the effectiveness of this order and whether this directive is in fact being followed, because it doesn't appear to be something that is being followed by this government.
Point of order,
it seems
Chair.
to be.
Mr. Turnbull, on a
Mr.
point of
Cooper
order.
talks about dwelling in the dark. That's what his conservative leader is doing by not getting a security
That's not a
clearance.
point of order.
Can he maybe answer why
That's not a
his
point of
leader,
order.
who we know that
Point of
the
debate.
conservative leadership race included
Mr. Turnbull.
the People's Republic of China interfering in it, why he
Turnbull.
won't get a security clearance?
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. We're getting into debate there. I think you're a seasoned parliamentarian, so make sure that points of order are focused on legitimate points of order. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to address the point raised by Mr. Turnbull. And to that end, the Leader of the Opposition has been very clear. He'll take the same brief that the Washington Post received. He'll take the same briefing that the Prime Minister.
Okay, the other committee's on.
Before we start with Mr. Barrett, everyone just aware Ms. Gee IT is going to contact her, so please just direct the questions to the two gentlemen in person in the meantime. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours. Go ahead, please. 6 minutes.
In Emily Nicholson's email of June 17, 2024 to Minister Jolie's Chief of Staff, she states, both CNGNY HOM, that's Mr. Clark, and staff have been instrumental throughout this process, with the HOM, Mr. Clark, providing the green light for the selection of the new residents. Do either of you have personal knowledge of Mr. Clark's involvement?
I don't have knowledge of his involvement, but...
Oh, Tom Clark's actually
Have you
here.
spoken to Mr. Clark about this matter?
No.
Oh, wait, no, that's
So
not Tom
who
Clark.
relayed to you the information about this process?
It's a process that was a long process, Mr. Chair. It started
Yeah,
10
he's the
years
Department of
ago,
Foreign
and
Affairs.
all through all those discussions, there was a lot of interaction with mission staff. So we are under the, we had a lot of discussion with people on the ground in the real property and administration team, and that information would have come from the administration team.
So when asked how Ms. Nicholson got this information, she stated that she engaged with the property branch, specifically you, sir, and your team, including the gentleman sitting to your right. So did you communicate, Mr. Dubois, or correspond with Ms. Nicholson about the summary that she had provided in her briefing note?
Mr. Chair, I did. We interact very often with Deputy Minister Associate Office.
Okay,
and
so what
in
was the
this
date
case,
that you had that interaction?
I had a written interaction with that with Ms. Nicholson on June 14th.
Okay.
Where I was fulfilling a request to provide details with regard to the transaction.
And you, Mr. Hunzangbe?
Yes. Mr. Chair, I had an interaction with Emily Nicholson on June 16 on that matter.
What about on the matter of the correction that she issued by email on July the 25th?
Mr. Chair, on July 25th, I had an interaction with Ms. Nicholson, but it was a request for additional information and clarification, which I provided. There was no notion of correction in that at that moment.
So nothing that covered her previously having said that the head of mission was dissatisfied with his residence and was looking for a change, or that he'd been instrumental in selecting the new place. No change in that verbiage that she'd used in that briefing note.
We took the July 25th opportunity to add more information and clarify, because the message that came out on June 14th that I provided was done very quickly, and tried to summarize it as much as possible. On the 25th, there was more details in the message.
Since we're going back and forth about a lot of dates, could both of you gentlemen please table for the committee any specific correspondence on this or surrounding those two dates between you and Ms. Nicholson? Would you be comfortable providing that to the committee?
We can go back and, but I believe that those correspondence would be included in the package that has already been submitted to the committee.
Okay, so it looks like Ms. Nicholson shared the truth on the 17th of June in her email. And then there was interaction with the minister's office. And then this committee sent for Mr. Clark as part of our investigation. And then she issued a correction. And then her story changed from the truth to what she offered later. And that the chronology, the path, appears like that direction came from the property branch. So, gentlemen, you're the subject matter experts. Who in Minister Jolie's office did you coordinate with in making those corrections, those clarifications that you mentioned in the July email?
Well, Mr. Chair, as I explained, the message on June 14th was to provide information on that transaction. On June 25th, we provided more information. I did not coordinate directly with the minister's office. I was in contact with Ms. Nicholson, who's the chief of staff of the deputy minister associate.
So, did you have any interaction with anyone in the minister's office?
No, I didn't have any interaction.
So between the 14th of June and the 25th of July, you had no interaction with the minister's office?
No.
So in the original summary that you said you provided to Ms. Nicholson, your summary said that Mr. Clark was instrumental? That was the information that you provided to her, and that it was issued hastily, or that was something that she surmised on her own?
That information is not contained in what I provided.
Okay, so where would she glean that information from? She described herself as merely air traffic control. She was just taking bits of information out of the air and landing them on a piece of paper. So if not from you, who is you're the responsible individual, the subject matter expert, then where would she have got that?
Well, Mr. Chair, I think Ms. Nicholson has testified on it to say that it was a misstatement that she had put in her email, and then she expressed her intent that was to basically convey that the head of mission was aware of the situation.
Sir, she said that you provided her with the summary.
I provided Ms. Nicholson with a summary of the transaction, and there was no mention of Mr. Clark being instrumental.
That is our time, gentlemen. We'll go now to Mr. Souza, please, for 6 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, let me get this straight. The Consul General in New York is one of the most important missions that we have in regards to our relationships with the United States, and the official residence home to one of Canada's most senior diplomats, right? The concerns about the conditions of the official residence were actually first raised in 2014. And furthermore, the new official residence, as I understand it, is now one of the lowest costs per square foot. It cuts monthly costs in half, savings of about $115,000 a year, and it represents $7.4 million in savings to Canadians as a consequence of the sale of the old residence into the new residence. So here we have a senior diplomatic mission in the United States that all provinces use, that many other Canadians have taken advantage of with regards to trade negotiations and discussions. In fact, I understand that the head of the mission's residence supports diplomacy and trade and has hosted over 50 official functions in the last 2 years, including business events, roundtable discussions, seminars, and briefings. It's a very active residence in regards to the work it does with our counterparts and partners in the United States. So the question now before us is, was the minister involved in the decision to sell the old official residence or the purchase of the new residence? Did that happen? Was the minister involved in those decisions?
Mr. Chair, no, the minister was not involved in that decision.
Is it normal, however, to have the tenant of the residence be aware of what is taking place?
It's absolutely part of the process to make sure that the tenant is aware of the plan.
And would you ask the tenant for the status of which the issues are undergoing and their ability to make that move?
Well, in building the statement of requirements, we will solicit the input from the mission administration that may include some.
So there's nothing untoward, regarding the semantics that's being passed around here today, there's nothing untoward about having that discussion, correct?
Correct.
All right. Did Tom Clark have any influence in making the decision?
No, Mr. Clark didn't have any impact on or influence on the decision. The decision followed a process that was supervised by a governance body that had stakeholders from all over the department.
Understood. Did Tom Clark approve the decision to sell or buy?
No, he did not.
Right. Did Tom Clark approve the decision to purchase another residence? No. Was he involved? How many other options were available to the purchase?
Well, we reviewed 21 residents or 21 apartments when we did the due diligence and the review. Yeah.
I know it's a complex process. I know there's a lot of diversified elements that come to fruition to make a transaction of this size a reality in parts of your overall retirement portfolio. Can you briefly explain, for the purposes of this committee, the process that leads up to that decision?
Absolutely. I will certainly ask my colleague, Mr. Ouzangbe, to provide more details because
Please
he's
do.
really the person in charge of the process. But what I can say is there's a very sophisticated process by which we do a full analysis of the whole lifespan of the assets, and then this analysis goes through different kind of lenses. There's legal, there's security, there's procurement. There are a lot of people.
Out of curiosity, if Mr. Tom Clark says, "I don't like that residence," does that mean it won't be purchased?
No, it would not.
It's not up to him.
It's not up to him. No.
Can you explain more, Mr.
Mr. Chair, yes, I was very involved in this transaction. I did oversee the transaction from start to finish. I was the chair of the Real Property Governance Committee that oversaw the transaction, and I did sign the transaction, so very happy to provide some clarification elements. It's a three-step process to review these sort of transactions. The first one is to establish what the requirement is. In other words, what is the problem that we're trying to solve with a given property. That is overseen and approved by governance. The second step is to think about the option analysis. What are the different options that can resolve the problem identified in step one, and that is again approved by a governance committee. And the third piece is the expenditure authority, confirming that all the conditions have been met with the property and that it's been thoroughly reviewed by security legal stakeholders.
Much more time? 50 seconds. Can you explain Tom Clark's involvement at the beginning and at the end?
Mr. Chair, I've had no interactions with Mr. Tom Clark. He was,
Well,
to
they
my
turned down the
knowledge,
mics.
not directly involved in the decision-making process to either dispose of the current official residence or the selection process to acquire the new one. He was aware of our intentions and our plan, and it was clear to us, but his role was limited to making sure that the doors of the unit could be opened for appraisals or visits or things of that nature.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Vignola for 6.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being with us again to the witnesses. We received,
Okay, this translator is extremely quiet. I can't even turn them up. Like I've maxed out my output.
The condo or the condo rules.
You can't even hear the translator.
The ones for the cooperative. Is that something that we could
You literally can't even hear the translator. We're spending like tens of thousands of dollars to get this committee going and make it run with translators and tech guys, and they can't even get the translator's audio right.
The current representative of Canada in
It's insane.
US lives at 550 Park Avenue also.
Okay, so since we can't hear them, let's tune into the House for 5 minutes, and it'll go to NDP.
Protect from real good change.
And it'll go to Conservative. So I'll just check to make sure we catch the Conservative round, because their mics are at least working properly.
By pushing environmental rights in the agreement that we have, because that's going to be more investment, not only in terms of fairness across the board for all of us, but then we can also compete more internationally, stronger than ever before.
Then comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, just to follow up with the question that I had posed, the member had indicated just give the Conservatives what it is that the Conservatives want. The Conservatives want us to grab unredacted documents and hand them directly over to the RCMP. The RCMP don't want that. They've said they don't want that. The Auditor General of Canada has said they don't want that. Other legal experts have said that that should not happen. My question to the member is, does he believe that we should listen to the Conservative Party or the RCMP, Auditor General, and other legal experts? Who would he listen to if he were me?
Order. The honourable. There's an honourable member who's trying to answer questions, and he doesn't even have the floor. So I would just ask him to please wait till the appropriate time. The honourable member for Windsor West.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I know I just find it, like we were talking about another issue, but I find it ironic. I was in this chamber when the Liberals, under their current leader, supported Stephen Harper over 110 times on confidence motions without getting a single thing from the Conservatives at that time. Nothing on the environment, nothing on the economy, nothing on human rights, nothing at all for anybody, anything. So we'll take no lectures from the Liberals in terms of their dilemma on how they deal with things, because I actually saw the physical evidence as the Harper government tore down labour rights, tore down environmental issues, invested in things that were not good for Canadians, because actually during that time we had austerity issues get reversed around, and they actually ran up one of the largest deficits in Canadian history. And all of that was done by the support of the Liberal Party unilaterally with not a single condition over 110 votes. And I think that's important to note, because that's the real history of Canada.
Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister.
Okay, they turned back up the mics.
Issues, as we heard, for the consul's condo. As far as I know, the
It took them like 4
renovations
minutes.
that were done in 2010, 2011 would not have been the same. The regulations would not have been the same because those came in 2021. So it's more the different equipment, make the apartment more modern and extend its lifespan. Now, is there an evaluation notice or assessment for the upcoming updates, for example, on accessibility, future costs? Mr. Chair, that's a good question. I'd have to check. What I know is that that apartment has not yet gone through the complete review process that the state still. So it hasn't gone through the same review process for the condition of the apartment. But that will be part of the elements that are taken into consideration when the review is done, and then we'll try to see what the best option is to update its condition. Thank you very much. these questions.
Oh. Now they can't get their committee to work properly. Wow. They are having some wonderful tech today. Whoever's in the tech room needs to...
By blocking and paralyzing
the actual house is working.
using ill-informed tactics that no Canadians appreciate. Canadians want us to be able to work together to bring forward legislation that helps them, that helps eradicate forced
back
labor
on?
in our
Yeah, okay, I got the committee back on.
Mr. Chair, I
Man,
don't
they
have
need to
that
get their tech issues fixed.
information exactly on that. The general.
Oh my lord. Somebody in the committee in the tech room unplugged the... Somebody stood on the cable. Because the house is working fine.
Are respected. Enterprises that use and profit them that profit.
Nope. Okay. Now it's the house too. It could be me because I was having some issues yesterday, but I ended up getting it fixed. No, they suspended Ogo.
Leave them to my colleagues.
It's showing as suspended.
Thanks. Before we get to Ms. Blaney, we're just going to suspend for 30 seconds to try another mic check.
Yeah, see, they did suspend, and he said it was because it was because of the mic issues. So I suspect they are having tech issues in Parliament. I don't know how it I don't know how long it takes them to fix mics and why they even need to take up committee time, which is really only allocated for 2 hours overall to fix mics. It just sounds ridiculous. Let's see if we can watch Cooper. Nope, they suspended this one as well. They've suspended almost all the committees. So this isn't just a issue with one committee. This seems to be an issue across the entire House.
That is why the government has committed to introduce legislation that this year that will make Canada's ban even stronger. Madam Speaker, in October, the Minister of Export Promotion, International Trade and Economic Development launched public consultations on
Chris Johnson just said they listed it now as in camera. They listed it this morning as in camera, but Ogo's not in camera today. So I don't know who's running their tech who's in the tech room this week. If they have a bunch of new hires, Ogo is back.
Well, could you just explain
to me
a little bit more about when you're looking at these properties and moving towards having these properties purchased? What do you look at in terms of resellability? We know that Canadians want to know that their investment is sound and that it would bring equity, hopefully, to the country eventually. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about value for money and the process that you go through.
Thank you for the question. It's a good one. It's part of when we do the life cycle assessment in a real property transaction. We look at all of the costs associated with an asset and also all of the potential gain in values that this asset may take. As I'm sure you understand, New York is one of the highest and more active market on the planet. So we did look at what could be the appreciation of the asset over time. We are not in the business of creating capital gains out of our transactions, but we certainly look at what is the potential value for Canadians in terms of not only being able to use it, so it's well located in an area that will allow us to that will be conducive to our business type, which is diplomatic kind of activities, but those areas are also those areas where normally we will have assets that will retain and gain values. So we do look at this. This is not a primary factor, but it is certainly a factor. Maybe my colleague, Mr. Ouzangbe, wants to add a little bit to this.
Mr. Chair, the question was also around the policies around this, and that's definitely part of my my area of responsibility. What we're using when selecting a property in New York or anywhere else is Chapter 5 of the 2014 Property Management Manual, and that acts a little bit as a checklist for us to see for that class of official residents, these are the different elements that we need to take into account, and we check them against the requirement of the official residents. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I'm going to try Mr. Huzambe. I got it. Okay. Or I somewhat got it. So I appreciate that. So one of the things that I've found out through my own personal research is that the contractor that was part of building this building was a non-union contractor and actually had some really poor labor practices in his time of building, where a lot of people were out wages and whatnot. So I'm just wondering, if there isn't a policy at looking at the ethical building of a place that we might be buying into, is there a process that we could go through that would actually allow that to be a policy or regulation that we look at when we're purchasing? It makes me sad to think that people suffered and now we're living in that place. A representative of Canada is living in that space. So I'm just wondering if there's any thought to that, or could it be something that was explored?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question and the opportunity to clarify. Certainly, that's something that we are sensitive to. We did understand the context surrounding the construction of this building via the work of this committee. Currently, I'm not aware of any policy that governs that governs specifically that area. I think the government of Canada is sensitive through any acquisition to the labor involved and the impact on labor. Certainly, that's something that we can take under advisement, but at the moment, I'm not aware of any policy that dictates a review of the labor conditions before the acquisition is made.
Thank you. I have no more questions, Chair.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mrs. Kusi, please. We'll go to Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock?
Officials, you have now confirmed that the consular office in New York City is one of the most important missions in America. And by extension, clearly the Consul General, Tom Clark, is in a very influential position within America and his relationship with Canada. Would you agree with that?
The mission in New York is one of the largest mission and most important one we have.
And Tom Clark himself carries a lot of weight. He was chosen for a reason, and his position carries a lot of weight. You agree with that?
I would agree that all heads of missions have an important kind of status.
Right. Now, Tom Clark appeared at this committee September 12th, 2024, and I'm going to read out his words. Mr. Chair, I will repeat once again, and please, if you wish, you can put me under oath for this. I had nothing to do with the decision to sell the old official residence. I had nothing to do with the decision to buy the new official residence. I had nothing to do with deciding on its amenities or its location. Officials, we have 2 official documents from your department that say to the contrary. The first was through an ATIP, and it says that the Consul General in April 2023, 2 months after his appointment, shortly after his famous jovial ride in the limousine with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, informed ACM senior management that the property is not suitable for representational activities, and it is not suitable as a residence and requires immediate replacement. Immediate replacement. That follows up with an email from Emily Nicholson, which confirms that the Consul General, Tom Clark, and his staff have been instrumental throughout this process, with Tom Clark providing the green light for the selection of the new residence. These are 2 official documents from your department that cast serious discrepancies on the veracity of Mr. Clark's statement. It's time for you to stop running cover for Tom Clark and to confirm, as you've already confirmed, that you've been in regular contact with his office, that he indeed was instrumental. He asked for an immediate replacement. So both versions of the truth can't be right at the same time. Tom Clark has been lying to this lying to this committee, lying to the public, and you are covering up, other officials at GAC are covering up for this lie. So what do you have to say about that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to clarify. One comment that is being referred in terms of Mr. Clark, what Mr. Clark would have said is like third-hand information that would have been reported by his team to the project team that have made.
Well, let's talk about that. What does ACM stand for?
It's an acronym, a symbol that we use in the department.
Okay. He says he informed ACM senior management. I want a list of everybody he spoke to. Can you give me some names right now?
Well, the document says that Congen informed ACM. Congen is the mission, not the Consul General himself. So the mission has reported that the
So who were the names of the officials at GAC that Singen reported to?
We are ACM here.
You are also ACM?
Yeah.
Okay.
The both of us.
And you will table any and all documentation to this committee in relation to that level of communication in April of 2023?
I can go back and look at what exists, but yeah.
Okay. So we have you two individuals in person. We have one who's having difficulty connect. Was she also involved?
No, I wouldn't think so.
Is it just the two of you?
Yes.
They can't even get a witness to
What
connect.
about senior management? Were they informed?
Well, we did inform senior management, being the Deputy Minister Associate, on June 14th of the transaction.
Who in particular at the mission itself in New York City were you communicating with?
Oh, my interaction with the mission, it was through the head of administration.
Okay, I want names. Can you identify all the names that you were communicating with at the mission?
Yeah, I did provide the name at the last meeting. It would be the management consular officer.
Was that the only person?
There are two of them because there was a rotation in 2023. But yes, I have two individuals that have been in contact.
And you've supplied this committee with those names?
I did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bain, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Department officials for joining us today. You know, I wanted to just first ask, is it common for a new head of a mission to express views on their accommodation at all?
Thank you for the question. This it would be common for any head of mission or any occupant of our provided properties abroad to have an opinion about their housing.
And what kind of opinions? Is it like, okay, is this suitable for this? It's not operational. Is it suitable for meetings? What can we host here? Is this? What are sort of some of the views that they would want to express? Like, I mean, if I go into a workplace and into a highly important role ultimately, and you have a strategy of how you're going to carry out your duties, how you're going to, establish relationships, and all of these things. So, what are some of the maybe views that other mission heads have stated in when they've been deployed to certain mission regions?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It's as we explained before. If we stick to official residences, those official residences are workplaces, so in which employees will be delivering all kind of representation functions. So all of the criterias that are associated with being able to deliver those functions could be subject to an opinion. Sometimes, the accessibility would be one. The security could be one as well, depending on where you are in the world. There's also the seating arrangement, the number of people that can be accommodated, the kind and type of event that can be hosted there. So all of those elements could, its location sometimes could be as well subject to an opinion to say that it's not best located because it's not attracting the kind of business or business people that we want to bring into the official residence. And the second half of the official residence is living quarters for heads of missions, and they will often have opinions about the living quarters for say, and you also have the division of the two. So in the case of New York, there were issues about the floor plan layout not dividing very well the representational space, sorry, and the private space, which also is an issue that is raised by heads of missions often.
Yeah, I mean, it's important for a workplace area to be separated from a living space where you don't need, when you're conducting business, people walking through certain areas. That would be a private area. I understand that. So when selecting, I know we've talked a little bit about this, selecting the property locations, also based on where our, allied nations may be, some of our greater trade partners. For example, we know where we have now a new administration coming in the United States. And it's important for G7 nations to ensure that their priorities are met. And the friend shoring is important right now. So, can you maybe speak a little bit more to how important the location and this specific location where it's situated with some of our key trade partners?
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to provide a bit of details, and I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Uzangbe, will have a bit more.
Oh, come on.
Normally
we're
in
not
the
missing
vicinity
much
of
with
our
Baines.
like-minded, as you mentioned. So being close to our G7, G20, and other allies would be critical for the conduct of the kind of business we have. Also, as well, the proximity of local authorities, making sure we can connect with what are the local either business or diplomatic or governmental organizations. Another factor we take into account is the proximity of our office. So we want to be in the vicinity of where the offices are to facilitate the transit in between the two facilities. I don't know, Mr. Uzangbe, if I forgot anything that you would like to add.
We have no time is what I think he wants to add. So perhaps you can get to it with Mrs. Vignola's round. Go ahead, Mrs. Vignola.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I need a reminder. When was the decision made to purchase instead of renovate taken? I'll let Mr. Uzangbe answer that because the process is really under his supervision. Mr. Chair, the official date is June 29, 2023. Thank you. So, let me know whether I'm mistaken, but a council is there for 4 years, is on their posting for 4 years. Yes, with the possibility of extension depending on the negotiations. Yes, 4 years. When they appeared, the appraiser and the broker stated that a condo goes for, on average for $1.6 million. And I said, what do we get for that? What do you get for $1.6 million? Because that seems cheaper. And he said, well, a studio. One person in a studio If you can use shared offices on Lexington Avenue or something, that might be something that you could handle. But is a council always single? Sometimes do they take their children with them? You know, when you plan a residence for a council, or is it just for that council, or is it for, you know, a possibility of whoever's going to come in with family or not over decades? Yes, your question is very relevant when we know that a property's life cycle will be 50 to 60 years. We try to have as much flexibility as possible in terms of number of rooms, configurations in terms of family and number of rooms, rather. There could be people who are single, people who have families with more members. We need to have residences that will serve all of those councils. We often hear about 60 years as a lifespan. I want to mention that because I think it's something that's common in the Americas. And elsewhere in the world, 60 years is quite short. There are buildings that, you know, are 700 years old or a few hundred years old. Why don't we try to aim further, to look further in our processes? I mean, that would be remarkable. Canada has a 200-year-old residence in New York. I mean, wouldn't that be great? Why don't we go further than 60 years?
We do not have time for a response, but perhaps you can provide that in writing to us. We'll go to Ms. Blaney, and then we'll finish up with Mr. Brock, Mr. Jouari. Then I need about 30 seconds committee biz to do the budgets, which went out.
All right, we'll
last
get Brock
week.
again. Cool.
Go ahead.
I'm going to have to do some resetting on my end just to see if it's me, but I'm like 99% sure this is a Parliament issue.
I don't know if we have any official residences that are over 100 years old, but it's very possible that the locations are in heritage buildings or that they are many decades old. The issues are more in terms of the deterioration or the midlife refit. That's around 50 to 60 years that we do that. So that's what we want to know. Can we get to 50, 60 years and then make the decision? Is it still viable to renovate it, or should we just purchase a different residence? The decision could be to renovate it, to keep that residence. We don't have a preference one way or the other. It really depends on the age, where it's at. We look at the building appraisal. Is it better, or rather the assessment, is it better to renovate or sell?
Right. We will go to Mr. Brock for 5.
All right, Brockinator.
When the Counsel General, Tom Clark, was exposed as a liar in relation to the documents that this committee received, he wrote a letter to this committee. He said all his comments to GAC officials, meaning the two of you gentlemen, were only made in passing. And I think we can all agree as to what that term of art means, in passing. If I say, this meeting went well, that would be a comment in passing. If this meeting didn't go well, that would be a comment in passing. But when Tom Clark, the head of this most important mission in the United States, calls for an immediate replacement of the old residence, if that came from his officials, they certainly wouldn't be doing that without his authorization. Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't be able to comment on this.
Well, of course. The bottom line is he is the head of the mission. Someone 5 or 6 or 10 layers below him is not going to make a decision to GAC that says, in my view, this official residence is no longer suitable. We need an immediate replacement. That comes from the top and it's filtered down. That was a direction made by Tom Clark. He influenced GAC in making this decision. Isn't that correct? He was instrumental. He gave the green light. He has lied to this committee. Do you agree that he has lied to this committee?
To my knowledge, he didn't lie to the committee. To my knowledge, I received a comment that has been referred to from his staff to our project management team. It's been written.
You
in the
think the
document.
words, "We need an immediate replacement of this extravagant penthouse in New York City," you think that was made just a comment in passing? Like, how's the weather today? What are you doing for the weekend? It's a direction. Do you believe that's a direction? An immediate replacement. I want a new residence. This old residence is not suitable for me. That's a direction. Do you agree?
Mr. Clark didn't mention that to me.
Thank you. I cede my time to Ms. Kuzi. Thank you.
All right, Kuzi.
Thank you very much. Are head of chancery and head of administration the same currently at CNGNY? Yes.
Yeah, the management concert officer is the head
Excellent.
of administration. I mentioned head of administration
Perfect.
for simplicity.
Thank you so much, Merci. Who were the heads of property under Mr. Bott and Mr. Vistra, please?
The head of?
Heads of property.
Oh, that would report to them?
Correct.
I wouldn't know their name.
Okay, could you please find out the information and get that to the committee, please?
I can look it up. Yes.
Thank you. Does, under the current platform structure, does WSHDC still have responsibility over CNGNY?
Can you repeat the first acronym, sorry?
WSHDC, does it still have responsibility in the platform over CNGNY?
No.
Okay. That's interesting. That's changed. In your opinion, because when I left the platform, Washington still had responsibility over CNGNY. In your opinion, as an employee at a mission, would you do anything you possibly could to fulfill the request of the head of mission?
Well, if you're at the mission, you try to do what is best for the operations of the mission, which includes the head of mission being able to deliver what he needs to deliver.
Certainly. And would you say that the head of mission has the final say in terms of decision making regarding the mission?
Regarding the mission operations, the head of mission has the authority.
And thank you for that. And Mr. Chair, I will say to Canadians who are watching, I was at Global Affairs Canada for close to a decade and a half. I served in missions abroad, and I can tell you that the head of mission has the final say on all of decisions. You, as an employee in the mission, will do whatever you possibly can to fulfill the will of the head of mission. If the head of mission wants an event, you will do whatever you can to create that event for that head of mission. If the head of mission wants a relationship built, you will do whatever you can to create that relationship for the head of mission. If the head of mission in this case wants a new property, you will do whatever you can in an attempt to get that head of mission the new property. So you said yourself the mission informed you. Unfortunately, it seems to be you continue to run cover for Mr. Clark. So I will ask you one final time. Did Tom Clark lie to this committee?
No, Tom Clark didn't lie to this committee. This decision was made independently by headquarters, and he didn't have influence on it.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Shawari, please.
Thank you, Mr. Duan. Welcome back to our committee. Hopefully, after Mr. Clark, you can go back to the work. That's very, very.
Oh my Lord!
Hopefully, after Mr. Clark, you can go back to the work. That's very, very.
Man, they it's the last round and they can't even get
anything to do
their
with
stuff to work properly.
The purchase of or any influence with the purchase of this property.
No, he did not.
Did the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Joly, have anything to do whatsoever with the purchase, a decision to purchase or influence of this property?
No, she did not.
Okay. Did anyone within the office of Minister Joly had anything to do with influencing the direction that this process was going?
No.
Did Mr. Tom Clark, the head of commission, had any influence whatsoever in making a decision and influencing the process that your colleague, and I apologize, I'm going to really ruin your last name, Juan Zagabe had in influencing that decision?
No, you did not.
Okay. Does the head of commission have influence in deciding whether they would like or they would not like to reside in a premises that's given to them?
No, they would not.
Okay. Can you draw a difference between a desire to build a relationship with, or improve a relationship with the G7, G20 mission, as opposed, and then all the team members mobilized to make that happen, as opposed to buying a property? Because that seems to be the last conclusion, that the head of mission, whatever they want, they get. And the base of that comment is that if a head of mission sees fit to build a relationship with, or strengthen a relationship with one of the G7, then that happens. What's the difference between that type of mandate or that type of goal or that type of desire, and comparing that type of influence with their ability to be able to choose a residence to live?
Well, what I would say is, in this particular case, it was a great opportunity to solve a decade-long problem that we had with an aging property that was not meeting our requirements, and acquiring a smaller and less expensive property, so creating savings, not only immediately, but also in the long term for Canadians. So in that, I would say that was the driver. Basically, there was no influence other than goodwill to fill a requirement that we had and creating savings for Canadians.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much time I have left. 2 minutes. Okay. So no influence at any level. A process was followed. The value, we've shown a positive value. And there are processes in place to be able to divest from the portfolio. Can you give us a range of the number of initiatives as such that exist right now across GAC to be able to replace a residence for the head of the commission?
Okay, right now, out of my working from my memory, I don't think we have a lot of projects to replace official residences, but we do have a lot of projects to either renovate, maintain, or upgrade some of those official residences. We came out of the pandemic with a large backlog. We had a lot of work that had been deferred, and our intention was to put the efforts to basically catch up on those delays. So we do have a certain number of official residences that are being looked at right now in terms of option analysis, or projects that we would like to conduct there to bring them up to our standards.
Holy smokes!
Up on those delays. So we do have a certain number of official residences that are being looked at right now in terms of option analysis, or projects that we would like to conduct there to bring them up to our standards.
I'm going to do some resetting before question period, but I don't think this is on my end. I'm almost 99% sure this is on Parliament's
Thank you very
end.
much. And I know you need a couple of budget items to pass, so I'll yield the rest of the time back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jouari. Mr. Dubois, Mr. Uzongbi, thank you for joining us. Ms. Gay, thanks for joining us for a second time. You're close to the record of most appearances without actually being able to speak. So you are dismissed. Quickly, we have 3 budgets to approve.
Chair, sorry.
Yeah, can I get to my budgets first, and then I'll return to you, please?
Okay.
First one, we've got, official residence, Consul General, it's 2,500, approved, wonderful.
Budget, not the cost of the residence, right?
Yes, thank you. The PBO meeting, we had him on for next week. The subs have just come out, so we're going to move him back because I don't think his report will come out in time.
Yeah.
So we'll move it back. But that's
Parliamentary Budget
750.
Officers, PBO.
Thank you. And then the last one for public service integrity and the procurement ombudsman If you recall, we said we'd do 1 hour of each, but we have not scheduled a time yet. If we can have approval for that as well. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I appreciate that because I've already signed them in advance. Yes, Mr. Genuis, don't mind being quick so we can get out of here.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I think we're into committee business now. So I'd like to move a quick motion that relates to what was discussed in the first hour. And the motion is that the committee call on Randy Boissonnault, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Official Languages, to immediately resign from Cabinet, and that this call be reported to the House.
Crazy motion.
Are we in committee business?
Yes. For the
This
budget.
committee?
For the budget, yes.
I thought we concluded that already.
Well, we haven't concluded the meeting yet, sorry.
So, colleagues, I think it's obvious why this is being put forward, why this is important. We have a Minister of the Crown who pretended to be Indigenous. He was described repeatedly by the Liberal Party as being Indigenous. He described himself as having a Cree great-grandmother in the House of Commons, which has turned out to be false. He misrepresented his identity, and we have heard repeatedly how serious Indigenous identity fraud is. And this minister did it for perhaps a variety of reasons, but clearly one of the reasons is that he was
Sorry, Mr.
allowed,
Genuis.
able to
order, Mr.
Yep,
Chair?
sorry, Mr. Genuis. Go ahead, Mr.
Yeah,
Sousa.
I'm having some misunderstanding here. Can the clerk define, are we in committee business? Would you just not, what is budget or not? Like, I'm being told that this is not committee business.
We were in committee business for the budget. We hadn't adjourned, but committee business till it's adjourned or not committee business.
I understand. Moving a budget is not the same as committee business.
Yes, Mr. Chair, it's true that, for instance, when a committee does pass some budgets, it's for the purpose of writing the minutes. We will say that the committee indeed proceeded with the committee business, and also.
Oh, come on, Parliament, man. Get your stuff together today.
Proceeded with the committee indeed. Proceeded with the
Fix that one
committee
quick.
business, and also.
Oh, my Lord. I'm going to send them an email to this committee and tell them that they need to get their tech guys fired.
Ms. Blaney, if you wish. Go ahead,
Chair,
Mr. Jones.
this may be an uncomfortable subject for the Liberals, but the fact is we just had, before this committee, the Minister of Indigenous Services, who affirmed that Indigenous identity fraud is a very serious matter, who pointedly refused to defend the Employment Minister at all, and
oh, my Lord,
pointedly
man.
refused.
Yo, is anybody else seeing this on Parleview? Is this just me?
Pointedly refused to defend the Employment Minister at all, and
I can't watch this. If that's just going to be like this, I can't watch the rest of this committee.
Or was this on the agenda, though? Man, this
I
is
can't
not
keep having to
related the
refresh
budget.
every 30 seconds. This is ridiculous.
Committee, it doesn't have to
Yeah,
be related
can you guys
to the
learn the
budget.
rules, please?
I stated that we'd go into committee business at the end. We did that. We did not adjourn, so we're still in committee business. Mr. Genuis, you have the floor, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Look, the minister who was here wouldn't defend Mr. Boissonnault, and it seems that these Liberal MPs are using
sorry,
How many points of orders are you going to do
points of
over
order.
Carnett?
Chair,
Let the guy
I'd
talk.
like to challenge your ruling, please.
Certainly. Mr. Clerk.
Okay, Ms. Atwood?
No.
Separately, Charles.
Mr. Baines?
We can discuss after.
Mr. Baines? The question is whether or not the ruling by the
That's
chair
funny
shall
to you?
be sustained.
Sorry, I'm trying to listen. I'm trying to listen to this, but you're interrupting. Sorry, say it again.
The question is whether or not the committee would like to sustain the chair's ruling or not.
No.
Mr. Johari?
No.
Mr. Long?
No.
Mr. Sousa?
No.
Ms. Block,
Yes.
Mr. Genuis,
Yes.
Ms. Kuzi,
Yes.
Madame Vignola,
Wait.
Ms. Blaney.
Yes.
Yeas pour 5 and nays contre 5.
5.
So you need to break the tie, Mr. Chair.
Yes. I shall
Yeah.
abstain myself. Mr. Genuis.
Well, thank you, Chair. This is striking that. Whoa, sorry. Yeah. It's so striking, but I'll try to stand. Lean back a little bit. Yeah, I'll try to contain myself. Thank you. Okay, so the Liberal Minister of Indigenous Services is unwilling to defend Randy Boissonnault over this issue of Indigenous identity fraud. Yet you have Liberals who are trying to avoid the discussion of this issue.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes,
Is there a motion? Like, I don't know what he's talking about.
He read the motion into the record.
Well,
He read the motion
I didn't
now.
quite understand that motion. I didn't quite hear it.
But then why didn't you challenge the chair over it if you didn't
Because
hear the
we're
motion?
not in committee business. We're not in committee business.
We are
I'm
in
challenging
committee
that point.
business.
Like, what were
I
you
have
challenging?
ruled.
we're not.
Colleagues,
Like,
please, let's address this.
I haven't
will
seen.
ask-
I'd
will
like
ask
to
the
understand
clerk
clarity.
It was read out, but I'll ask the clerk if he could
Please.
report it out to your P9. Continue, Mr. Genuis.
Okay, so the motion has been moved. It has been distributed, but if members would like it read again, the motion is as follows. That the committee call on Randy Boissonnault, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Official Languages, to immediately resign from Cabinet, and that this call be reported to the House. Conservatives, and I believe all other opposition parties, are calling on the Prime Minister to remove Randy Boissonnault from Cabinet. This is the minister who pretended to be Indigenous, who told the House of Commons that he had a Cree great-grandmother, which he now admits is false, who has made all sorts of contradictory claims about his identity, who the Liberal Party said was Indigenous at various times in the past. So this is a minister who engaged in Indigenous identity fraud, and he did it perhaps for a variety of reasons, but one of which was enabling the company that he owned to claim that it was Indigenous while bidding for contracts from the government that he is also a part of. So he's a minister, he owns a company as well. That company was bidding for contracts from his government, and he was claiming to be Indigenous. The company was claiming to be Indigenous owned, and neither of those things were true. But this was designed to advance the commercial interests of his company and to make himself wealthier. This is the definition of corruption. It's identity fraud, it's corruption, it's lying about his identity in order to steal resources that should be going to real Indigenous entrepreneurs and real Indigenous communities. If that's not the sort of serious offense that leads to someone being removed from Cabinet, then I don't know what is. And you know, Mr. Speaker, we've got 5 Liberal members sitting across the way who tried to prevent me from moving this motion. None of them are in Cabinet. I'm sure all of them would like to be in Cabinet, and yet Randy Boissonnault remains around that Cabinet table despite his outrageous, offensive conduct. So the question today is, are we going to be able to pass this motion, or are we going to see Liberals who were passed over in favor of Randy Boissonnault filibuster to defend this corrupt pretender, or are we going to see this committee be able to get to a vote on this motion? And I hope we're able to get to a vote on this motion so that we can send a clear message that Indigenous identity fraud is serious, it's wrong, and it's been done in this case in order to advance the commercial private interests of a minister of the Crown. This is deplorable stuff. The minister must be fired. I hope we will be able to get to a vote quickly so that this minister will be fired, that a clear message will be sent to the House on this. And once we get to a vote, all committee members will no doubt be able to proceed with other things. So let's get this done. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. I have Ms. Blaney, then Mr. Souza.
Well, first of all, yeah, it is loud. I just want to ask, first of all, if the clerk could send us a bit of a calendar. I know that's a side note, but I heard a lot of things that we're going to do. It'd be great to have a calendar. I guess in response to this, I know that our MP, Blake Desjardins, has very clearly asked for the resignation of this minister. And I will say that I find it very sad and very frustrating. I am a white woman. When I was 4, I was adopted by an indigenous family. I am very clearly white, but I belong to a family that is indigenous. And I have to walk that line very carefully. And I do it very carefully, even when it hurts my family, because they feel that I belong to them. So when somebody is careless, and I'm not going to sort of give ill intent, I'm not going to say that he was a bad person who is upright lying. I don't know the story of his family. But when you do these things, you must do it very carefully to respect a people that has been marginalized since the very beginning of contact. And so to be careless about it is very upsetting to me, because it doesn't acknowledge the historic wrongs that have been done and the long-term implications of those actions. So when somebody isn't very, very clear of who they belong to, where they come from, and they make comments, it is harmful. So I agree with this motion. I don't necessarily agree with some of the drama that I'm seeing around it, but it makes me very frustrated to see a human being tell those stories of history like they belong to him without clarifying that they belong to him. Who gets to share a story is very, very important, and how you do it is very, very important. And, you know, we heard today with testimony from the minister about trying to get it right, and it's never going to be right as long as it's held within a colonial system. And so we need to make sure that the level of accountability is incredibly high, and that we don't mistake a colonial history, people losing connection to their traditions and their families because of that colonial history. Those are complex stories, but when they are told, they better be told correctly. And I'm very concerned that we have a minister that I don't understand not only why he isn't being removed, but why he doesn't gracefully and with dignity withdraw himself. Maybe there was a misunderstanding, but man, I have to say, when you're going to speak, you better speak honestly, and you better make sure that what you're saying is correct. And that is wrong. And so I will be supporting this motion, and I certainly hope that we can get this work done. And I really don't know why he hasn't stepped down.
Agreed. Randy's so disgraceful.
Thanks. I have Mr. Souza, and then Mrs. Block.
So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Boissonnault, the minister, I believe, is appearing before this committee, and he's agreed to do so. And I am of the understanding that there is lineage within his family with indigenous members, and he's apologized for not making that clearer. But regardless of all of that, it's also been very clear, and it's been stated multiple times, that the company of which he was a partner some time ago never received and has never been put on the indigenous list. So that doesn't exist. And he never received contracts as regards to being an indigenous company. So he's not on the list. He hasn't received contracts. And he's made it clear that he's not involved in the day-to-day operations of this organization. So, and then now the purpose of this motion is now to call into question the work of cabinet and those of the Prime Minister's office in determining as we go forward. It's not really relevant to this committee in terms of goings on with respect to what the decisions of the cabinet
very relevant.
should be. I know they're so eager to be in power. I mean, they're already putting curtains up and trying to move furniture and trying to determine how to renovate the various residences and what they're talking about. But my goodness, we have ongoing regards to the workings of trying to enhance the contracts and the economic success of members of the Indigenous community. That's the whole point of going forward and some of the practices that we have in place. And we have systems to curb those that may try to be fraudulent in those activities in regards to any matter of procurement. So, Mr. Speaker, this motion is certainly all about politics. It's a great opportunity for them to do a few more social hits on YouTube. It's about their opportunity to get out there to provide for even greater misinformation and manipulation of issues, just as they're trying to do the same with the residents in New York. We have some serious regards to trying to help members of the Indigenous community. We have very serious abilities to improve their lot in life, and they have done an extraordinary job of getting involved in procurement and involved with contracts with government. In fact, I'm very pleased by some of the meetings and engagements that I've had with some of their financing groups and so forth. That allows for them to be at the forefront of major engagements in Canadian economic activity. And the members opposite, when they were there in power, so to speak, certainly trying to engage and be powerful in their accusations and in their slogans and in claiming falsely the notions of people's integrity and engaging with their own manipulation, frankly. And it's frankly somewhat disgusting to see the degradation they have of putting people through the ringer from the bureaucracy onwards. And yet, unlike the Conservatives at the time who were charged, who were found guilty, that was serious.
Oh.
No real truth.
It's like the fourth time.
Real truth and reconciliation.
In the
There
last
wasn't a
5
proper
minutes.
engagement with members of the Indigenous community. In fact, it was the opposite. And now they're standing here trying to be all holier than now when they're in fact the ones that were to blame from the get-go. We're doing what's necessary to provide for true partnership, for true engagement. They're taking and abusing the system for their own gain and not for the gain of Indigenous communities, certainly not for the gain of other Canadians who are working hard to establish that relationship, Mr. Speaker. I will be voting against this motion.
Good for you. Hurry up and get
Do
to
I
a
have,
vote.
Mrs. Block?
Thank you very much, Chair, and I do appreciate our colleague's intervention at the very beginning. I believe she's captured very well the essence of the issue that we are trying to address. It is welcome news to hear that Minister Boissonnault will be attending committee. That's a bit of a surprise to us, but it's a very welcome surprise.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
I do want to say
Point of order.
that...
Sorry,
just to clarify, Ethics Committee.
Oh, my Lord. The committee's almost done anyway. But yeah, this definitely isn't me. This is definitely a Parliament thing.
Clear, because we heard this from the minister over and over again, that Minister Boissonnault's company, Global Health Imports, was not on the IBD. That's not the point. The point that his company was not on the list is not the main issue here. The main issue is that we have a parliamentarian, a cabinet minister, who has misled his caucus, has misled the cabinet, has misled parliamentarians, and has misled Canadians in an attempt to defraud the government out of money that was intended to go to an Indigenous-owned company, that was intended for Indigenous-owned companies. It's a small set-aside. We were very genuine, I believe all of us around this table, when we agreed to undertake this study on Indigenous procurement and to get to the bottom of what was happening. We've heard from many witnesses many Indigenous organizations and witnesses who have identified for us that there is indeed fraudulent activity taking place within this program. I'm going to state it very clearly. The Liberals, the Liberal members around this table, and Liberal members in the Liberal caucus cannot claim that this is a serious issue and that it must be looked into, and then not deal with their own colleague who has admitted to misleading Canadians, who has admitted to misleading Parliament, and who, by the Minister of Indigenous Services' own admission and testimony, is involved in fraudulent activity by the very nature of admitting that he misled Canadians by telling them that he was Indigenous when he was not. So that is the issue that is before us. It is our duty to hold a member of Parliament, to hold a member of Cabinet to account when they lie about who they are, specifically to defraud Canadians out of their hard-earned taxpayer money and to defraud a program that was intended for somebody other than themselves. I would ask that every member around this table support this motion so that we can demonstrate to Canadians that we are willing to take this situation seriously, that we do not support what this individual has done and the misrepresentation of his office and the authority that he has. And so I would call upon all members to support this motion and call for, to call for the resignation of Randy Boissonnault immediately.
Hear, hear.
Well, we have no one else on the speaking list. So, well, colleagues, I'm going to remind one last time, as I stated last meeting, to avoid this issue. I will announce the next two speakers. It's going to be up to you folks to maintain speakers list if you wish to. If not, I'm going to go straight to a vote in the future. So I warned last week.
Point of order.
Let me finish, sir. I warned last week, so colleagues, if we could just keep an eye on that, please, so we avoid that kind of conflict here. Go ahead, Mr. Gerritsen. I have Mr. Baines on the speaking list.
Yeah, just as a point of order, with all due respect, I mean, a debate is about listening and speaking. So I might not know that I want to speak until I've heard the last words that have been spoken. So I respect that ruling, but I would encourage you to at least keep the door open to the possibility that we might want to engage in debate as to the last words.
That is why I recognized Mr. Baines and brought it up. But it's not up to me to maintain the debate,
Chair.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Baines, go ahead. And then I have Mrs. Vignola.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to this debate about or talk on this motion. And I see members from across the way who also, like myself, are in serving in the Ethics Committee, where the Minister Boissonnault is scheduled to appear, and maybe this could be one of those times that we can just have a friendly understanding, and many of the members here are also serving in that committee. They have the opportunity to ask these very same questions. He's already scheduled to appear, and instead of tying up the important work that we're doing here and duplicating that work, I think it may be an opportunity for us to agree that and members who may be here quite often come and sit on the Ethics Committee and have the opportunity to ask their questions there as well. So we do have an upcoming meeting where the minister is scheduled to appear. He's appeared there multiple times already. He's answered several questions on the magnitude of all of the investigations that are being directed his way. So I think that this could be a good opportunity to have an understanding and see and have this the questions that Mr. Genuis is bringing forward and that could be asked there in that committee. The minister is already scheduled to appear there. So I think maybe if we can all agree that could be a good solution to moving forward from here.
Thanks. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Thank you, Chair, for letting me take the floor for a few moments. As I said earlier, I have friends who were not recognized as being Indigenous because their mother was Indigenous, not their father. This was fixed maybe 15 years ago, and they're older than I am. I'm 47. So they spent a large part of their lives being raised in their mother's culture, but without ever having the legal right in the eyes of the all-knowing country of Canada to call themselves Indigenous. I'm particularly sensitive to this issue. And to be honest, I'm listening to both sides. I haven't heard the minister say he is or isn't Indigenous. On the one hand, I'm hearing, yes, he says he's Indigenous through a grandmother who doesn't exist, who never existed, and then the other side is saying, no, that's not exactly what happened. So I will reserve the right to do my own analysis of the situation and avoid partisanship on this issue. As for the issue of his resignation.
Oh. You know what?
Very much appreciated.
At least that went quick. I do need some time to reset, so
Forgive
if they
me?
keep going longer than 10 minutes, I'm just going to call it there in the next 10 minutes, because I'm going to see if there's anything on my end, but I'm quite confident it's
Parliament's used to being in a classroom where people listen to what everyone has to say and not people speaking across the table and over each other. So, at the moment, there is a question of privilege in the House of Commons that has to do with this very question. There's a study at the Ethics Committee that has to do with this very issue, and I believe that the question of privilege should be wrapped up before we move on. Every person, every party has a right to be heard under this question of privilege. Asking the minister to resign today at OGO when the topic is being discussed, when it hasn't been explored at length yet, doesn't make sense. I believe we should see the situation with a bit of perspective here. If at the end of this question of privilege and the study at the Ethics Committee, if at that point the committee and parliamentarians determine determine the facts and it is not a partisan interpretation, then it will be up to the minister to do the honorable thing, or it will be up to the Prime Minister to decide what to do. If we're indeed dealing with pretending to have an Indigenous identity, which is a serious thing. So I would like us to respect the process that is underway, that was requested by the Conservative Party when it tabled a question of privilege regarding this issue with the minister in the House. And so I would like to be given the opportunity to hear the discussions within the House of Commons and to listen to the discussions within the Ethics Committee and For those
Randy has
reasons, I will
testified
be
like
voting
15
against
times
the
in
motion
committee.
today.
He just lies
The
every
motion
time.
tabled by this very same Conservative Party.
Sorry, Mr. Shawari, then Mr. Sousa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So
Liberals just want to filibuster this last little bit.
I am trying to make sense of why members of this committee is trying to bring a motion on a study that we all agreed, and the importance of it is clear to everyone. I personally was the one who bring it up during the ArriveCan study, and I asked the Dalian president, like, what kind of value did your contract added to the indigenous community? How many employees do you have that they're indigenous? How have you built? So this study was is very close to my heart and our team. And I think a motion like this coming out of this study and this committee will actually do a lot of damage to the great work. And I'm really looking forward to the report and some of the recommendation coming out of the report. I think is going to do a damage on it. There are many unknown factors. What we know right now is there is a media report. There's claim that the minister had talked about the link to the lineage under two different, let's say, indigenous group, and he talked about his interpretation, and he's apologized. Now, also, the company that he partly owned, and my understanding is he had divested long before, and was not on the list, as you heard today, and there was no contract awarded. I'm not sure whether there was any contract requested or there was no contract rewarded. There was no set aside. So when I look at this motion, I look at it and I say, well, the way that we are asking that the minister steps down and then report to the House is almost, if I want to be really partisan, and if I want to draw a parallel, I can say, hey, look, you know what? The leader of official opposition has repeatedly refused to get security clearance.
Here we go with the security clearance again.
Come back and go and get the briefing that's needed. And as he claims, come back and say, hey, look, you know what? These are the members of parliament, openly. These are the member of parliaments that are on the list. So is it now fair, and is it the right thing? Not only fair, but is it the right thing to come and say, well, you know, let's pass a motion that because the leader of the official opposition has stepped down, should step down because he's refusing to get the security clearance, and then go and we report it to the House. So I think we should forego about this motion, and I'll be voting against it. Thank you.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Chair, we've made it clear that this is being discussed at Ethics Committee. We are all concerned about making sure that the Indigenous community is protected, and I say we stop the discussion and go to a vote.
Good. Go to a vote.
Anyone else? So we will go to a recorded vote.
All right, and then after the vote, I'm going to take a bit of a break, make some food, and we're going to go question period. Question period's in 23 minutes.
Mr. Shah?
We need Bloc to vote with the Conservatives, and I don't think
Mr.
Vinola's going
Baines?
to vote with
Against.
them.
Mr. Jouari?
Against.
Mr. Long?
No.
Mr. Sousa?
No.
Ms. Block?
Yeah, and I need to do some resetting as well, just to make sure it's not on my end.
And
but-
Liberals, yes.
Madame Vignolo?
No.
Ms. Blaney?
Yes.
OK, yeas pour 4-4, nays contre 6-6.
6-4, so it gets defeated.
Adjourned.
And it's adjourned. Okay. Question period is in 20 minutes, guys. Here is the link. I'm going to go ahead and do some resetting, and I'm also going to try having a separate web browser open, running the House as well, because it could always be a web browser issue, but I'm almost positive that it's Parliament having the issues. Anyways, sorry about the tech issues again today. It was still annoying, so I've tried everything I can on my end here. I'm going to try a few more things that I haven't thought of, like try another web browser and things like that, but like Parliament had issues with the House stream. They're having issues with their mic. They had to suspend. They were having issues with audio on the earpieces. So I think they're just having tech issues this week. It's just one of those weeks. But anyway, I will see you guys in 20 minutes. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and let's head over to question period. Here's the link in chat again one more time.